Welcome back. This is the Catholic Lady, and we are reading Great Line of God by Taylor Caldwell. This is chapter 10 and part 1, we are beginning part 2. In part 1 of chapter 10, Saul goes out into the city of Jerusalem, and he's seeing the innermost parts of the city for himself for the first time, the market area. And he stopped in an area to have a rest. And there he beholds a woman which holds his interest, and he can't seem to take his eyes away from her. And he wonders about her because of her beauty, that she could not be the poor person that she resembles in her clothing. And then her son comes and brings her food, and he is gentle with her, and she calls him Yeshua. So here is, in his person, Jesus with his mother Mary. And Saul is watching them intently and seeing the loving and caring that they both have for each other. And he wonders about that. So now we continue with chapter 10. Respect for mothers was implicit in the religion of the Jews, but Saul had often thought it too elaborate and very often undeserved. He said Kaddish obediently for Deborah, and often wondered where that child's soul reposed and in what flowery nursery it played, or if it slept in the dust like a flower on which an iron heel had been imprinted. Yet his mother had not been a plain woman such as this woman. She had been born of a venerable and illustrious house, and had been a patrician, and the name of her fathers was honored at the gates of the city. In her way, she had had some learning. She was no stranger to the arts of the Hellenistic culture, if she were, indeed, less understanding of the religion of her fathers. Why had he not honored her as this probably unlettered workman from some scorching hill obviously honored his mother? Deborah had been almost as beautiful and certainly charming. I have been a son, thought Saul, watching the two near him with a cold and obdurate heart. Forgive me, my mother. You did not love me, and I did not love you wholly, but I should have honored you. Am I less than this obscure man who regards his mother as the holiest and purest and sweetest of all creatures, and esteems her with every gesture and every glance of his eye? Alas, I am less. I am much less. The young man reached for the basket with the doves and drew out a leather bottle of wine and a brass cup. He opened the bottle, and Saul caught the scent of the wine. It was poor and cheap and acrid. The young man filled the cup and held it to his mother's lips with deference, and she drank, her eyes again on his, blue and beaming. The attitude of the two, sitting in the hard and lonely sunlight, friendless and alone, was excessively touching for all its stately posture, its proud simplicity. Crowds hurried along the great courtyard. Shadows were deep purple and sharp. Voices and footsteps were noisy. Children darted everywhere, and merchants with carts screamed and uttered imprecations. Yet these two sat in a mysterious isolation, as if unseen by all but Saul, and unseeing except for each other. The one giving profoundly, the other taking with humility. Saul had seen the man's arm as it had emerged from his garments. It was brown from the sun and muscular and masculine, familiar with labor, endowed with the ability to lift and carry with ease. His ankles and feet, too, were brown. They had known the soil of pastures and stony places, of torrid noons and bitter winds. We are all one, all sons before our Father, blessed be his name. Hillel ben Baruch often repeated. As that was a doctrine of the Jews, Saul had believed it, but only intellectually, except for one short interlude. But all at once he truly felt a oneness with these people before him, and he wanted to speak in spite of his pride. It was then, as if Saul had truly spoken, that the young man turned his kingly head to him and looked at him fully. Their eyes met, And it seemed to Saul that his heart raised itself and shook, and all his limbs were disturbed. The azure of the peasant's eyes seemed to advance on him, as if in truth he had risen and was approaching the youth, holding him powerfully with his gaze. All sound disappeared from Saul's consciousness. Now he had been drawn into the circle of remote silence and isolation with these two, and they were alone together. To Saul there came a sensation as of deep and unearthly fear, as well as a massive force drawing him to the young man. All his mind was assaulted by something mysterious and compelling, yet terrible. Part of his soul said to him, "It is absurd, for you are Saul ben Hillel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and learned, and of a noble house, and your name is not despised even among the proudest and the most royal. And this man before you is nothing but a peasant, and possibly cannot even write his name. Therefore, why should he draw you to him? And why is your heart inflamed and troubled and bounding like a lion?" But another part of his soul said to him, "Arise and go to him." The young man was gazing at him quietly, his expression still and grave and curiously alert and sad. Yet his lips were smiling faintly, as if he too had recognized Saul and knew him for what he was. The golden brows almost met above the large, deep eyes. The wind ruffled the golden hair and the beard. So clear was the light, so vivid the concentration of the stranger upon Saul, that Saul himself saw more intensely than usual. He saw the dim blue shadows below those pale cheekbones, as if pain dwelt there without surcease. He saw the veins in the white temples and the throbbing of the brown throat. The woman, too, was gazing at Saul, the brass cup near her lips. Her hand trembled a little. "They are sorcerers," thought Saul, and the terror increased in him, for all a portion of his mind laughed at this superstition. So he sprang to his feet in disorder, and he fled from that place, and did not look back, and did not cease his hurried steps until he entered the marketplace again. And the clamor and the cries rose up about him, and the masses of the people lurched against him, and he was free from his enchantment and the clangor of the world that had never seemed so dear and safe to him as it did now, and so protecting. "I have escaped," he thought. From what he had escaped he did not know, but he was sweating violently, and he felt he had been in some awesome jeopardy, but the jeopardy was unknown. He bought a handful of ripe figs and ate them greedily. Then slowly he began to laugh at himself and to wonder at the emotions he had felt. He walked on, looking at the little shops with a friendly contempt and amusement. He looked at the pretty dark-faced slave girls and felt aversion, and then a vague pity for their state. When he came out again into sunshine, he said to himself, "I am alone and lost, and I do not know why." It was then that he heard, or thought he heard, a tremendous, familiar voice calling to him, "Saul, Saul of Tarshish." He looked about him wildly, but only the market rabble and the merchants were about him, and the asses and the camels and the screaming children, as they raced up and down the broad, shallow stone of the steps. "I am going mad," he thought. "They have laid a spell upon me," and he ran again, murmuring aloud the prayers against the evil eye. And then he stood trembling, the figs in his hands. He had heard that voice before, in his bedroom, in the holy temple, and he was covered with a dread confusion. The house of Aulus Platonius and Hannah Bos Judah was in an unpretentious section of the city, not far, alas, from the street of the cheesemakers. Therefore the air was permeated at all seasons, in all days and nights, with the odor of sour, ripe, or new cheese. To Hillel, remembering it, it had a reassuring scent. It was a sound and earthy and full of authority and permanence, unlike the graceful and perfumed gardens of Shabuah ben Abraham and his sons, which seemed to Hillel, at least, to have the odor of decay and transience. and graves, and not to mention decadence. Aulus, as a rich man, and Hannah, as a rich woman, could well have lived in the heights of a mount in a fine villa, and with many slaves and servants, but they were frugal. They resembled each other in temperament. Their tastes were simple, not out of delicate ostentation, or because of penuriousness, but because simplicity was of their nature. They had a fine library, the heritage Hannah had received from her father, and beautiful gardens of flowers and vegetables and fruit trees and palms, though the gardens were of necessity small in that crowded area. A single fountain stood in the center of yellow gravelled paths, and in the shade of a carob or sycamore tree Hannah would work with her few women. In all this, Hannah also bore a resemblance to Clodia Flavius. Hannah, however, was of a different attributes, soft of voice, deferential of manner, meek of gesture, gentle in speech, hesitant to advance an opinion, sweetly anxious to please, and of a will which made Clodia's seem to be as bending grass. The large brown eyes in the shelter of thick black lashes might appear to be the eyes of a doe, but a certain glint in them could make the burly Aulus quail and daughters tremble. As the old Jewish woman, she kept her hair covered, but sometimes a brown strand of it, as frail as silk, would drop over her calm forehead. Her face was as round as a coin, and expressed absolute innocence and womanliness. Her lips were tender, and her complexion pale gold, for though, like Hillel, her forebears had come from Galilee, she had the darkness of the Judean. Hillel loved her dearly. She had been like the elder sister to him from his childhood. He also remembered the weight of her hand in less moving moments. If indeed all her ways are pleasantness and all her paths are peace, Hannah Bas Judah was queen of the household, and Hillel often smilingly suspected the king also. Aulus greeted him with pleasure and embraced him and kissed his cheek. Shalom. This house is honored to receive you, my cousin, said Aulus. Hillel's hands lingered on Aulus's shoulders, and the Roman, who desperately at all times tried to conceal a certain sensitivity of temperament, it was unbefitting a soldier, felt that lingering and unconscious pressure of Hillel's fingers. Ah, he thought with commiseration, the family of Shabua ben Abraham have been too much for my poor friend. He slapped Hillel heartily on the arm, and inquired of Saul and why he had not come also. Saul, said Hillel, is restless and disturbed, and is cooling his fever with explorations of the city. Youth is not an agreeable state. Aulus's eyes were kind as they studied Hillel's face. Truly, he said, and he led Hillel through the atrium into a pleasant room, full of sunlight though spare of furniture, and with a stone floor on which lay a few woolen rugs of no particular value. There were no murals here, no statues, no fine vases, no lemonwood tables, no crystal or Alexandrian lamps, but it had a certain immaculate comfort, and Hillel sat down. Aulus clapped his hands, and a servant appeared, and Aulus ordered refreshments. How is our beloved Hannah? Asked Hillel. Aulus, as a soldier, had few illusions, but he had one which could provoke Hillel's secret amusement. In spite of Hannah's absolute rule over the household, Aulus was convinced that she was the most docile woman, and he invariably forgot the occasions when none dared defy her will when she had collected her mind. Had he remembered, he would have persuaded himself that he had capitulated out of deference to her female weakness, and because he loved her and wished to humor her. He said with heartiness, leaning back expansively in his chair, "My dear Hannah is, as always, the noblest and sweetest of women." He beamed. His thick beard bristled with pride and affection. He wore a tunic of blue wool, for the day was cool, but he retained his iron-shod sandals, and now he made a loud clattering with them on the floor. There was an air of suppressed excitement about him. It was Hannah herself who led the servant with the refreshments, carrying white linen in her hands, her robe of gray and red, her head covered as always. She was small and plump like a dove, with a dove's full breast. Hillel rose and went to her at once and embraced her as she kissed his cheek, and then held him off to examine him acutely. She had not seen him for 17 years or more, and her eyes were the eyes of an anxious mother. "Hillel," she said in her gentle voice, and there was an inquiry in it. "I am well, dear Hannah," he answered, and was horrified that he might burst into tears. Hannah continued to smile, but she sighed. "And Sephora and Saul, whom I have never seen, my cousins also?" "My children, thanks be to God, are in good health," said Hillel. "You will see them at Sephora's wedding, which will be in 8 days from today." The maternal eyes were smiling, though still searching. "I have heard rumors from Aulus that Sephora is very beautiful. My own daughters are not beautiful, but have married to our satisfaction. We have grandchildren who delight us. I wish that blessing for you, Hillel, my beloved cousin." She covered a table with the white linen and gestured to the servant, who set out bowls of cheese and bread and fruit and olives and fish, with artichokes and oil and garlic, and a fine bottle of wine. Hannah watched with a benign attention and arranged the pottery plates and the simple silver cutlery. She said, not looking at Hillel, "The years pass, and we see those whom we do not love, and who are strangers to us, and our hearts grow sore with longing, because our kinsmen are far from us." "There was not a year when I did not hope to return, Hannah," said Hillel. "Ah, I am not reproaching you, my cousin. I merely observe. The years pass in duties, and they are not to be despised. But still, the presence of those we love can be most dear to us." "I will return in another year," said Hillel, accepting a goblet of wine from the servant, "and one day I will return and will leave no more." He did not hear the sad loneliness in his voice, but Hannah thought, "He has 2 children, yet he is disconsolate, my poor kinsman." Aulus suddenly stood up and went into the atrium. His gesture was so abrupt that Hillel was surprised, but Hannah had begun to smile. "This is a joyful day for us, Hillel. I must not spoil my husband's pleasure in enlightening you." She glanced through the door. "We had hoped that the pleasure would be here when you arrived. There has been some delay. Aulus is becoming impatient." There was such an air of peace and tranquillity in the house that the pain in Hillel's heart began to be assuaged. He watched Hannah's deft little hands. Hannah was some several years older than himself, but calm certitude and love and happiness had preserved her as no cosmetics could preserve the youth of a Roman woman. She might have been the bride at whose wedding he had danced as a boy, except for the wisdom in her eyes. They could hear the traffic and the noise of the street beyond the high yellow walls, and Hillel saw that Hannah was listening as if to distinguish a different sound. The air was fresh, though redolent of the cheese. Hillel sipped his wine and thought that his kinsman's taste had improved. Then Hannah's face glowed with joy, and a deep dimple appeared in her dusky cheek. She hurried into the atrium, and Hillel heard the hearty sound of men's voices. A moment later, Aulus appeared, swaggering, holding the arm of a tall young officer in the resplendent uniform of a captain of the Praetorian Guard. Hannah trailed behind, and though she smiled, there were tears on her face. "Behold, whom we have with us, Hillel ben Baruch," cried Aulus, his chest swollen with fresh pride and happiness. "Our son, Titus Milo, returned from Rome to visit us. He arrived at Caesarea but today, and we had his message only a month ago." Hillel had never seen Hannah's son, his cousin also, until now, and he rejoiced with the rejoicing parents. "Shalom aleichem," said the Roman officer, embracing Hillel and respectfully kissing his cheek. "Greetings, my dear cousin, Hillel ben Baruch, of whom I have heard much. He spoke in Aramaic. "Shalom, Milo," said Hillel. "It is a joyful day for us all, and I mean it from my soul." He observed that Aulus stood with his hand on his son's back, his shoulders face brilliant with happiness, and again he was lonely. And then he suddenly remembered that only 2 nights ago Saul had embraced him weeping in the atrium of Shabua's house, and his sadness lifted, and he thought, "I too have a son who is heart of my heart." Titus Milo Platonius was much taller than his father, who was of no small stature, and a lean, compact figure with a certain masculine and military grace, with broad shoulders and narrow waist and hips, and fine muscular legs beneath his soldier's tunic. He wore tall boots of supple brown leather embroidered in gold, and scarlet cloak, fringed in gold, and a belt of gold links, and gold epaulets, and he also wore leather armor, and his arms were strong and brown with the sun. His helmet of iron, overlaid with silver, was intricately engraved, and set here and there with sparkling jewels, and its crest was high and noble. And he wore the famous and terrible Roman short sword and a dagger, and there were rich rings on his fingers, and his leather wristlets were inlaid with gold. He was magnificent. But Hillel looked earnestly at his face, and saw that there was the shape of Hannah's, round and firm, with her dimpled chin cast in the mold of a man. He had his father's Latin nose, fierce and powerful, his father's direct eyes. But where Aulus's eyes were frequently kind, Milo's were stern, and his brow had an unbending look, and his cheekbones were like sun-darkened stone. Yet his appearance and countenance were noble and proud and compelling. And Hillel thought of Roman statues of heroes he had seen, and he knew why Aulus's chest swelled at the sight of his son. This descendant of 2 warrior peoples had betrayed no sign of baseness or hesitancy, and his voice rang deeply in the room, tender when speaking to his mother, genial when addressing his father. He put his helmet on a table, and Hillel saw his round cropped head, with bristling brown hair and large ears. Hannah hovered near him, touching him softly, studying him with her maternal gaze, and smiling through her tears. "You were delayed," said Aulus, himself pouring a silver goblet of wine for his son, and Hillel knew this was an honoring gesture from his father, for old Roman fathers did not serve their sons except as a ritualistic gesture. Milo, who had been smiling down at his mother, ceased to smile. "Yes," he said. He glanced quickly at Hillel, and his dark face became a little darker, and it was perturbed deeply. Then he smiled at his father. "You have not been on duty today, my father?" "No, I was awaiting our kinsman." Milo said, "There has been some trouble near the Damascus gate today. We will speak of it later." And we will pause here and move on to part